So, good afternoon, everyone. I think that was probably a good intro into my talk, particularly in the alternative finance space where it is more heavily regulated than some of the rest of you. A lot of you have probably heard me speak before, and what you hear me talk about is all of the gray areas in the law around web scraping, what the legislation is, what the case law is, and inevitably when I'm done, you guys ask me about your use case. You go, well, how do I analyze my use case? I want to know about how to look at e-commerce data and compliance. I want to know how to look at AI and compliance, and you have a specific use case you want me to look at. And so that is what we're going to do today. I listened. So we're going to go through 4 use cases. We're going to analyze it basically I'm going to give you the secret sauce that me or my team would use to analyze one of these use cases if they came in front of us for compliance. We're going to start with the easiest, which is e-commerce. Tends to be least issues. Then we're going to go into a bit about personal data, business executive database. I swear I didn't know about the LexisNexis talk when I wrote that. And then we're going to look at the newest thing, which is AI. We're going to take 2 AI use cases, one for a generative image AI, and then one for more large-scale data extraction to train a model. And so just as a kind of overview quickly, the potential risk areas that we always talk about, if you've heard me talk before, personal data. If you're agreeing to the terms on the website, you want to watch out for the website terms. Copyright, if you're using the data externally, particularly if there's copyrighted data. AI, our new fun use case, and if there's any sensitive data, so that's like health or biometric data. So this is kind of the checklist that you need. And I know it seems simple. We talk about all these like complex laws, but this is what we boil it down to. This checklist lives in my brain, and I go through it every single time someone comes to me with a web scraping use case. And I would add a row if you're in alternative finance, which is material non-public data, because you're regulated by the SEC and don't want to get in trouble for insider trading. If you are in that space, that box better always be no. If it's not, rethink. But other than that, this is going to cover almost every single use case of the things that you need to think about. And so what we're going to do is we're going to walk through that for those use cases. Where you check no, don't worry about it. Where you check yes, we're going to have to look into it. So here's our first use case. E-commerce product data. So the scenario here is you've got a company wanting to scrape e-commerce data for competitive pricing intelligence. This is one of the biggest use cases for web scrape data. And I added a few extra things in here, like where this company wants to add reviewer name into their schema and potentially do some in-cart scraping. So that's where maybe we'll get into some hairy areas here. And so what you'll see is there non-public data? Potentially, if you have to log in to put the item in your cart. That happens on some websites. Do you have to agree to terms? Again, potentially for that in-cart use case. Is there AI? No. Copyrighted data? No. Product name, price, all of that, that's just factual. Copyrighted has to be something more unique. So no. Personal data, reviewer name, very clearly personal data. External use of data? No, it's for internal competitive intelligence, and no sensitive data. So now you know, okay, I've got my yeses. So I've got 2 issues. I've got personal data, and I've got this whole agreeing to website terms login issue. So let's take the first one. We just take our 2 yeses and we analyze them. So is there personal data? That's your first question. Yes, a reviewer's name is personal data, even if it's not their actual name. If it is their screen name, that is still personal data, guys. Can be tied back to a living human being, personal data. For this particular use case, we're going to focus on the EU because the GDPR is the biggest and baddest data protection law in the world. And under the GDPR, you always need a lawful basis to process personal data. So you have to say, what is my lawful basis here? Do I have consent? No, you obviously haven't talked to all the people who've left reviews on these e-commerce sites. Do you have a contractual agreement? No. So your only option is legitimate interest. But in this case, I would argue, you don't actually need the reviewer's name. And data minimization is one of the big principles under the GDPR and almost every data protection law in the world. And what it says is if you don't really need the data for what you're doing, competitive pricing intelligence, don't take it, de-scope it. And it's as simple as that. And so in this particular use case, I would say you don't really need that data to do what you want to do, so you probably don't have a legitimate interest to it, so you just shouldn't pull that field of data. And to call back to Ian's talk earlier, when you use standard schemas from something like Zeit API, we just don't have reviewer name in it. So you don't have to worry about this legal consideration. That's that compliance out of the box piece. So de-scope is kind of the easy answer here. So there you go for that. Now you've got your in-cart and login analysis, which is a little hairier. So in some cases, we see e-commerce scrapers wanting to scrape things in cart because maybe there's special pricing or there's stock things. There's various things they can pull that way that they couldn't pull if the item wasn't in cart. But what happens is sometimes when you try to add something to the cart, the website wants you to log in. On some websites, not all. And for those websites where they want you to log in and they want you to explicitly agree to their terms of service, what the law tells us is once you explicitly agree to something, you have entered into a binding contract, which means you need to read it fully and you need to abide by it. And if it says no scraping or no copying or anything of that nature, then you should not be scraping behind a login. And more often than not, that is going to be the case. And so what's going to happen is you're probably not going to scrape in cart for websites that have a login. And that's OK. It limits some of the data you're going to get, but it doesn't limit everything. The other thing you want to think about, say there isn't a login, and you're like, OK, I can scrape in cart. You still want to respect the website, because there's other causes of action in the law, like trespass and interference with competitive advantage and all of this other stuff that someone could potentially sue you for. You don't want to put something in cart that's going to prohibit an actual user of that website from purchasing the product. And this is more of a concern typically for smaller websites. So if you can see that it's low in stock, or if you can see that it prevents an actual purchaser from getting that item, you're going to want to limit your use of this, and you want to keep it in the cart as briefly as possible. So again, you're not interfering with the operations of the website. So that's kind of your in-cart and login analysis. So that's what you do with an e-commerce site. Those are really the only things that typically arise there. But you could have some other unique things. But now we're going to look at business executive data. So this, in our last use case, we said personal data, we're going to de-scope it. Easy. I made it super simple. We can't de-scope it here because that's the data we're getting. That's the data we want. So we actually have to do an analysis. So let's go through our checklist again. Non-public data, no, it's all public personal data. Nothing behind a login, nothing non-public. Not agreeing to terms of any website, again, just public data. There's no AI here, you're just creating a database of individuals. Copyrighted data, no, you're just looking, again, for people's business data. Personal data, yes, a person's name, email, phone number. We'll go into a little bit more about that in a minute. External use of data, no, could be. You could be publishing this externally, but for the purposes of this, you're not. But if you are publishing it externally, you just want to make sure you're not outright copying someone else's database and republishing it somewhere else, because that could be a copyright concern. And that's why you want to think about external use of data. And then other sensitive data, no, it's just basic, very basic personal data. So you've got one yes, so you know what to analyze now. So here we are, personal data. So is there personal data? Yes and no. So name, yeah, it's always personal data. Direct email, so Sanaea@Zeit.com, that's my personal data. Info@Zeit.com, generic email, no, it's not personal data. My direct phone number, personal data. General business phone number that goes to the business as a whole, not personal data. Business address, not personal data. Only your home address would be personal data, and we're not looking for that here, right? We're looking for business information. So you do have a few fields of personal data, and now we think about jurisdiction when it comes to personal data. So we're going to look at the US versus the EU, because there actually is a difference, and a difference that has become more stark this past year because of the way the laws have developed. Do note that all state laws are different in the US. They don't have one big data protection law, which makes it very painful. We are going to slightly focus on the California law today because it is just the biggest in the US and it's the one that's most known. And other laws that are coming out are kind of mirroring it for the most part. So in the EU, we already know we need a lawful basis. In this case, you could potentially have a legitimate interest here. You're not going to have consent. You're not going to have contractual agreement unless you go out for consent of these business executives. And if you are going to rely on legitimate interest, you want to do an LIA, or a legitimate interest analysis. And you would, at that point, this is the point where you do need a lawyer or a data protection professional to actually do this for you, because you're probably not going to be able to do it yourself. But you might be able to find some templates online and give it a go. And in the US, it's a little different. They've developed the laws a little bit more friendly for us. And typically, we've always said, there is no distinction for public personal data and private personal data. But now there is, in the US. Any EU data, no distinction. Public data still has to have a lawful basis. But in the US, what the law now says is that if you have a reasonable basis to believe that it is being made widely available to the public, then that's an exception. And you actually don't have to go through all the hoops of the law. And so that's a really nice carve-out. And frankly, I think it's a really reasonable carve-out. And these business executives in this case, they have their name and email address and all of those things widely available across the internet. It's well known to them that that data is out there. And that falls really nicely into that exception. And so that's a nice place to see the law going, because it makes a lot of sense and it makes life a little bit easier. But even if you're in the US and you're scraping EU personal data, you still got to go with the GDPR. So be careful on that. So your result is, with GDPR, do your LIA, and make sure you have all your appropriate notification requirements. In the US, it's likely public data, and you're OK to go. So two slightly different analyses. And this is the first time this year that we've really seen that difference. So that's kind of a new nuance in the law. So let's get into the good stuff now, right? All of the new, crazy, wild stuff where I'm going to give you a lot of the classic lawyer answer of it depends and maybe, and we don't know where it's going because we don't know where it's going. So that's what's gonna happen here. But we have some cool, interesting guidance, and literally new things have popped up since I made these slides. So some of this is gonna be off the cuff, and I can't read it off here. So we've got an AI image generator. So you're training with, you're scraping images off the web, public images, so all public data, no non-public data. You're not agreeing to any website terms. Again, all public data. AI, yes, it's an image gen AI. Copyrighted data, yes, images are very clearly copyrighted data. Personal data, if there's people in the images, maybe you're only scraping images of buildings, I don't know. But for the most part, yes. External use of data, no, you're training an internal model. And other sensitive data, look, there could be other sensitive data in the sense that you could be scraping minors' data if there's kids in this. But for the purposes of this, we're going to say no, simply because that analysis is just way more in depth than we're going to go here. I could talk about the AI stuff for like 2 hours, guys. And then we're gonna look at the two AI use cases together, because the laws mirror each other very much. And then you've got large-scale scraping to train an LLM to create a chatbot. Non-public data, again, no. Agreement to terms, no. AI, yes. Copyright, so this is large scraping, right? You've probably got articles, books, research papers, all kinds of copyrighted stuff you're scraping, so yes. Personal data, there's tons of personal data in articles and books and all of that kind of stuff, so yes. External use of data, no. Training an internal model. And other sensitive data, again, maybe, depending on what you're scraping, but for the purposes of this, we're gonna say no. So that's what we've got. So for both, we've got AI, copyrighted data, personal data. So we've got 3 things we've said yes to, so 3 things we need to take a closer look at. So we're gonna start with the generic. We're gonna start with the generic AI stuff. We're gonna talk about AI and copyright, and we're gonna talk about AI and personal data. So to start with, right, you're gonna see if copyrighted works are in scope. yes, here, we'll talk more about that. Personal data and scope, yes, here, we're going to talk more about that. But then for AI, what's really important is actually your use case. What the laws are coming out with is there's higher risk AI and there's lower risk AI, and I think we all are aware of that. And for the higher risk AI, there's going to be more that you have to do, and for the lower risk, the less you have to do. And in the EU, the AI Act is in draft form. It is probably going to come out next year in its final form. And we're going to talk a bit about the risk-based approach that they take, because it's one of the first laws that's developing really clearly and has a good draft that we can actually look at. And then the case law ramifications, there are so many lawsuits in the US right now against Gen AI providers, and we don't have any results, but we can start to assess it based on some initial court chatter. No actual rulings, but there's a bit of chatter there, so we'll talk about that. So firstly, we're going to look at the EU AI Act, right? And we talked about the risk-based approach. So what they've said is there's minimal risk AI, which is, some basic stuff. And all you have to have is an internal code of conduct, nothing major, right? You got a policy internally, you're good to go. Limited risk, where you have to have, that's chatbots, right? So a lot of people are using this. A lot of people are creating these. So you just have to have transparency. If I'm using a chatbot that's giving Gen AI answers, well, then you need to tell me that I am. That's it. Simple as that. High risk. So when you start to use it for employment decisions, law enforcement, education, things like that, they're saying that's high risk, and you have to do a conformity assessment, which we'll talk about in a second. And then things like facial recognition, stuff like that, that is going under the prohibited category. So that is just, there's nothing you can do. You should not be doing these things. And again, this is in draft form. It's not a law yet, but it's coming. So if you're doing the high-risk stuff, these are all the things that they want you to do and expect you to do under the law. So you have to have a risk management system. You have to have technical documentation about everything you're doing with it. You have to keep records on all of it. You have to have a human in the loop. You have to have some human oversight here. You've got to have some really good, robust cybersecurity. So they're telling us this is what you need to do if you're going to create one of those systems. So that's the EU AI Act, and that's what's coming down the pike there. The US is a bit slower to turn the page, but there's some stuff coming down the pike there too. We just don't know what it looks like yet. So let's look at the copyright aspect. On the copyright aspect, so we already determined yes, right? There's copyrighted data in these data sets. Images, articles, books, any tangible, unique piece of work, music, videos, all of that, copyrighted data. Do you have permission? Some companies actually do have permission. If you have permission, off you go, great, no copyright violation. But by and large, I would say 99.9% of the people in this room don't have permission from hundreds and hundreds of websites to scrape their data and their copyrighted data. So what we typically rely on in the web scraping world is this concept of fair use. I'm gathering copyrighted data, but I have a fair use for it. And there's several factors in a fair use analysis, but one of the big ones is it's some sort of transformative use. I'm not just copying it and republishing it, I'm doing something with it. I'm laying something over it, changing it in some way, and so it's okay for me to use. It's no longer copyright infringement, it's fair. And we have some signals that I talked about from the court. It's not a ruling, it's a signal. And the court in this case in California, Anderson versus Stability AI, it's a big image AI generator. What the court was saying in this motion to dismiss, it was in an oral argument, so they haven't written anything down, they haven't made a decision. They said they don't actually think the images generated are substantially similar to the images that are used in the training model. So that could very much be a transformative use and a fair use, and that's what the indication from the court is. Just last week, Google had their motion to dismiss on their generative AI case in California, and they made the argument that we're not copying the data at all. We are reading the data, we are learning from it. And to say that reading and learning from publicly available data could rise to the level of copyright infringement is ludicrous. I think it's a great argument. I like it. Yet to see whether the court likes it. But what Google is saying is, you don't even have to get to the fair use assessment. It's not even copyright infringement to begin with, because I didn't copy the data. I just read it. I just learned from it. We all read and learn from data on the internet. How could that be copyright infringement? How could that be a data protection violation? They made that argument for all the causes of action against them. To be determined whether it's successful. I think it might be successful on some, not on others, but we'll keep you posted as that comes out. Will the AI Act apply? If you're providing services in the EU, the AI Act will apply. So even if you're based in the US, even if you're based in the UK, that EU Act is going to apply if you provide any services in the EU. So you're still going to have to do that risk assessment and follow the rules. And then the case law ramifications, we've talked a bit about that. This is all very much to be determined. There are pending class actions against OpenAI, Meta, Microsoft, Google, you name it, and there are multiple. So we have a lot still to learn there. And me and my team are tracking it all, so anything that comes out that's big or important for you guys to know, we will always make sure to put that out there for you. Then we look at the personal data aspect, kind of similar to some of our other analysis on personal data already. But like we said, yes, lots of personal data here in the images, in the articles, in the books, substantial personal data. And then sensitive personal data, right? We could have stuff about minors, about gender, race, age. All of these things are considered sensitive personal data and require a higher standard of assessment. We're not going to go into that full assessment today because, again, that could take me an hour in and of itself. But like we said before, you need your lawful basis. And what came out last week, like I said, lots of stuff happening, is the French Data Protection Authority. They gave us some guidance. And they said, we think your lawful basis could be legitimate interest, or a new one that no one really talks about, not a new one, it's been there, but task in the public interest. They're saying potentially that could be your new lawful basis for AI. And so there's a couple now that you can look at, but if you're gonna look at these, again, this is where you're gonna need a data protection professional, a lawyer, someone like that to do your legitimate interest analysis and then also do a data protection impact assessment because if the volumes of personal data are very large, if there's potentially all of this sensitive data in there, you're really gonna wanna do that DPIA. Gotta get a professional to do that. So if you're doing this at any large scale, I would definitely advise that. Always think about your data minimization as well. What can you descope for images? You know, I would where you can, I would descope some obvious personal data. If it's tagged kids or children, you're really gonna wanna consider descoping that. We don't wanna be scraping a lot of data about minors. That's just, it's not great ethically or legally. Families, people, obvious personal data. If you can descope that and you don't need it, descope it. And then lastly, you're gonna have notification requirements on your website. So if you are scraping a ton of personal data, you're gonna say that in your privacy policy. You're gonna wanna say that in your terms of service. If you're creating a generative AI application, you're gonna wanna make sure that the people who are using it know what's in it. It's really important to have that stuff up there. Lastly, I'm just gonna very briefly talk about ethics. So, like I said, we don't have a lot of laws on this yet. There is pending case law all over the world. China just put out an act. The EU Act is pending. The US is likely to put out an AI executive order soon. They're looking at legislation on deepfakes. It's all new. It's all developing as we speak. But we can still think about ethics, right? We can still follow some ethical principles while we're waiting for the laws. And you know, one of the things is we're seeing on a lot of copyrighted works that people are putting no AI tags. And if you're able to see these no AI tags while you're doing your scraping, the ethical thing to do would be to respect that where possible. So if you're able to respect these no AI tags on images typically and things of that nature, do that. You know, when you're building system, consider the biases that you could be putting into the system. You know, we had a talk earlier on misinformation and that kind of stuff as well. Your output is only as good as your input. What you train your model on matters. It needs to be correct information. You want it to be information without bias. I mean, without bias would be impossible, but with as little bias as possible. Because we're seeing racial and gender biases pop up. We're seeing job descriptions skewed to a particular gender. We're seeing huge issues with facial recognition in law enforcement. So consider the ethics around all of this. Be wary of spreading misinformation and fake content. All of this matters. What you train your model on matters a lot. Very briefly, just informationally, this is kind of the process we use internally at Zeit. If you're working with us on Zeit API Enterprise or a data project, our legal team would be going through this kind of risk assessment for you and with you, which is really nice to just kind of keep you on track. But we use the process that I laid out here, which hopefully gives you guys a tool set to do this yourself a little bit. Just another last call out is Zeit is one of the co-founders and co-authors of the Ethical Web Data Collection Initiative. We have put together principles on ethical and legal scraping, along with other web scraping companies across the industry, like Rayobyte, who spoke earlier. And we've all come together to say, hey, look, these are important. It's important that we have a unified concept of what is legal and ethical in the web scraping industry. And if you are in the alternative finance industry, there are also the FISD regulations in the US developed by people doing alt financial data, to which we are a co-author as well. So a really good resource if you're doing alt finance. So that's it. Shout out to my awesome legal team at Zeit, who I can't be as knowledgeable about all of this without them. So yeah, thank you.
Okay, so we'll wait.
Just no, Kevin.
Questions.
Just no.
Yeah, yeah, it's the default. Oh, there we go. So I don't have to come up with any questions.
I always feel the most popular as I ever have as a lawyer when I come do these talks.
Yeah, I had some questions, but I'll defer to our audience. Okay, so the factors about the jurisdiction.
So jurisdiction, okay, first start out where are you based. Where are you based is going to be one of the biggest factors in your jurisdiction, particularly for copyright and other stuff. For data protection, it is where your data subjects are based. So whose personal data are you scraping? So if you're in the US and you're scraping EU data, EU is going to apply, and so on and so forth. But you always start with your country.
Okay, thanks. And if you're actually researching, does that make any difference?
Yes, there are exceptions in various laws for research, so it depends on what area of the law you're talking about. But for example, under data protection laws, there are a lot of exemptions for research. So there are different nuances if you are using it for research or for public interest or public good.
I like the top one here. What about going to international seas to train an LLM without limitations? What's your view on that?
Do you remember when I said that the EU AI Act applies no matter where you are in the world if you are providing the service to people in the EU? So if you want to go to international seas and only provide your service to people in the country where you're doing it, sure. But that's probably not the best commercial decision, so it's probably not going to pan out well, and you're going to have to comply with US and EU laws as well.
Okay, so your favorite topic on CAPTCHA solving, what about using a headless browser to check availability of stock by mimicking a human?
Pass? No. Look, it's one of the gray areas. There isn't anything definitive that I can say, yes, this is right, or yes, this is wrong on it. I'd say just be careful. If you're in a regulated space, be extra careful. You never want to say you're a human when you're not, if you're in a regulated space.
I'm going to jump down a little bit because there's a few similar ones here. So this one down here at the end about companies in Europe and maybe even in the US have more data restrictions than other countries in the world. Do you think this works against us in the AI race? Just general.
No, look, I focused on the EU and the US. It's my focus of the law, and so that's what I focused on today. That's not to say other countries don't have stringent laws. Brazil has super strict data protection laws. Canada has strict data protection laws. Australia has strict data protection laws. China was the first country to come out with an AI Act. So it's not to say that there aren't other laws around the world governing this stuff. It's just in this room, EU and US tends to be, by and large, what we're looking at. But that's not to say that there aren't strict regulations in other places as well.
What about storing PII for internal purposes where you're not actually going to contact the person and so on?
That actually doesn't matter. GDPR applies the same, CCPA applies the same. Now, there are further regulations if you are using it for marketing and outreach. So there might be extra rules around it, but the data protection laws still apply even if you're just processing the data internally.
And our sister island here in the UK, what about their worldview on AI?
I would venture to guess it's going to tend to mirror the EU, similar to what they're doing with, like, they don't, once they exited the EU, they didn't have GDPR anymore, but they have, like, UK GDPR. It was very similar. And I would venture to guess they're going to do something quite similar to the AI Act, because they do try to align things like that. And ideally, globally, we're trying to align these laws because it is going to be very hard to have any meaningful AI if globally we're not somewhat aligned in the laws. So the UK, I would assume, would likely mirror a lot of what the EU is doing.
Okay, so there's a few kind of similar-ish ones, but the one I'm going to pick here is from Martin. Oops, it's gone. Oh, there it is. It's dropped down. Yeah, about if you assign anonymous ID to each reviewer for the sake of grouping reviews by author and website and save just that ID, is that considered personal data?
Okay, so good question. So if you give it an ID that you can't revert back to the original, that is considered anonymized personal data outside the scope of data protection laws. Great. If you give it an ID that you can easily revert back to the original, it is still personal data under the data protection laws. So if you are going to anonymize it with an ID, make sure you just can't get it back to the original personal data.
Okay, so we've a couple more minutes. What are your thoughts on the changes that Twitter and Reddit have started to put in place around their data for AI and so on? Do you have any views on that?
Where'd the question go? Sorry.
It's gone. Here it is.
Oh,
this one.
There we go.
Yep.
Okay, yeah, so look, we've seen Twitter has gotten very active in web scraping litigation. They've put a lot more bans. I certainly never would suggest ever scraping Twitter behind a login. But their new terms are aimed at them being able to train their own models, and I feel like a lot of companies are going to do that. They feel a proprietary right to their data that they've collected. And obviously, a lot of that data on Twitter is your data too. But yeah, they're going to put in terms that you then in turn agree to and give them the right to do that with your data. So, I mean, from a business perspective, it's probably a smart move, and there's nothing illegal about it, technically.
Okay, so following on from some of the other ones about real estate listings, the seller name, phone number, does that come in under any of this? Yeah,
so that's still going to be, it's going to be a similar analysis to the business executive analysis that we had, right? It is, it's, because it's just jumping all over the place. It's public personal data for the most part. Like, obviously, if you're logging in, totally different considerations. I wouldn't do that. But yeah, it's public personal data. So same, you'd have to do your legitimate interest under GDPR. And you could probably make an argument under CCPA in California that that's potentially data that they've made public and know is made public and is public widely available, so falls under the exception. So very similar analysis to that business exec one that we did earlier.
I know you've mentioned this one here before about websites that assume user acceptance. They don't explicitly ask. I don't know if you want to just clarify that one.
So yeah, so that's the where you're on a website, you don't explicitly agree to their terms, you're not logging in, all of the data is public. In those cases, what we would suggest is you don't need to read the terms and conditions. You haven't explicitly agreed to them, so you haven't entered into a binding contract. That's not 100% in the law, but that is the way that most web scraping companies and most legal experts would interpret that. The second you agree to those terms and conditions, whether that is clicking a button that says OK or anything else like that, you need to read them. You've entered into a binding contract.
So I'm going to answer this one. Yes, Elon does. He loves bots. Yeah, he does.
They're his favorite, yeah.
Yeah, absolutely he does. And I'm just going to pick this last one here. Any plans to put a blog or a resource, around any of these?
So that's it. That's an interesting point. If that is something that people are interested in, I absolutely will. We have it. We have a case law tracker that we use internally. We update it literally daily right now because that is how constant things are coming up right now. So I am more than happy to make part of that public if that's something people are interested in. So we could definitely put that up.
So there's two more in the middle, and you can pick which one you want to talk about. One about single-page monitoring under web scraping, the other one about reverse engineering anti-bot protections. Is any opinion on either of those?
So jurisdiction, when you bypass reverse engineer anti-bot protections, again, where you are, jurisdiction number 1, where the website is, jurisdiction number 2, you could be liable in either.
Brilliant, as usual, Sanaea. Thanks so much. And Sanaea will be hanging around if you want to ask her any more questions.
Thanks, guys.